Greeks are famous for a wide variety of developments that have influenced modern society. Democracy, philosophy, lifelike sculpture, classical architecture. Not a bad resume. But anyone who's ever watched Animal House knows that their influence goes far beyond the textbook. Now, Bluto's toga party isn't a perfect representation of how the Greeks got together to party. There'd be a little more wine and a little less beer back then. But it does hit home on the Greeks' proclivity for drinking and singing and entertainment. The ancient Greek Symposium was essentially a party where aristocratic men got together at someone's house to eat, drink, and be merry. In this lecture, we'll talk a little bit about how the symposium went down on any given night and the role it played within broader Greek culture. In doing so, we'll not only better understand the impact of the symposium on the Greeks, we'll also know how to throw more realistic toga parties. And isn't it about time your humanities classes taught you something practical? So let's start with everyone's favorite thing, etymologies! The word symposium is our version of the Greek symposion, which in turn comes from the Greek verb sympinyein, which literally means to drink together. So if you stop listening to this lecture right now, and if you only take away one thing, remember that a symposium was an event where a bunch of dudes got together to drink. That wasn't an invite to turn off the lecture though, so stay with me, let's keep going. Now when I said dudes get together, that wasn't a catch-all phrase for people in general. A symposium was limited almost exclusively to men, most of whom were rich and aristocratic. So no wives or daughters or mistresses or girlfriends or girls that are friends or anything of that nature. Sorry ladies. Actually, this is a good point to throw out a quick reminder. One of the main reasons we still put such a big emphasis on ancient Greece today is because it was the birthplace of democracy, of equality, with each citizen getting a vote. The problem, of course, is that it was only men, born and raised in a given city-state, that were given citizen status. So no women, no children, no foreigners. So let's not get too carried away when we talk about ancient Greece being the birthplace of democracy and equality. Back to the symposium though. The symposium process would begin when one of the aristocratic men decided he wanted to host a party. The host would then put together his guest list, probably somewhere between half a dozen and 2.5 dozen guests, most commonly around 10 or so. And the host would send his slave out around town to spread the word, assumedly taking RSVPs. Now where do we get these numbers from? Part of it is from the ancient texts. Both Plato and Xenophon wrote texts called the Symposium, and we have references to these events in other texts as well. We also have archaeological evidence in the form of vase paintings that show symposium scenes in the actual architectural remains of houses with symposium rooms. This symposium party room was known as the andron in ancient Greek, which literally means the man's room, the original man cave, if you will. It was a squarish type of room with a series of couches that sat against the walls. In a smaller andron, there would be one bed against each wall, so a total of 4. While some rooms could hold more than twice that. These couches could be made of wood or stone, hence some of them surviving till today, and we know that each could have held 1 or 2 grown men, who would lie back on the couches in a reclining position. Hence a little arithmetic is all it takes to calculate the number of guests at a party. Because lying on a stone couch wouldn't be very fun after the first 5 minutes or so, the host would have elaborate cushions laying on top of the couches. The walls then would be decorated with brightly colored frescoes or tapestries, and the floors often contained an intricate mosaic. As the men leaned back on the couches, small wooden tables were set up in front of each couch. There they could place their drinks and have some small plates of food. You couldn't have a good symposium without plentiful amounts of wine, and that wine was quite literally the center of the party. In the center of the room, in the middle of all the reclining couches, stood a Greek vase known as a crater. The crater was a mixing bowl where highly alcoholic wine was mixed with water to produce a less alcoholic drink. We'll talk more about the winemaking process in future lectures, but for now, know that the mixing of water and wine was something that the Greeks thought differentiated themselves from non-Greek barbarians, who would drink unmixed wine with a much higher alcoholic content. If you're trying to replicate Greek wine, it would be something around 2 parts wine to 5 parts water. The unmixed wine was a little stronger than most wine today, somewhere in the realm of 16 to 20% alcohol, whereas today it's more like 13 to 15%. So the final product would end up being somewhere between 4 and 6% alcohol after it was mixed, about the same as a beer today. This is still hotly debated though, so don't go betting any money on it. In case you're thinking of watering down the wine as watering down the fun, the goal here wasn't to tame the party, but rather to ensure that the party could last all night and attendees would only be shit-hammered at the very end. More on that soon. Now, lest you think that aristocratic men had to get up off their soft cushions and get their own wine, we know that there were young boys who attended these symposia, and one of their main jobs was to keep the guests supplied with Dionysus's favorite beverage. They'd head over to the crater in the center of the room and dip in a smaller Greek vase known as an oinakoi, literally a wine jug, and you can see that in the image here. And they use that to pour the wine into each guest's kylix, and that's the Greek name for the wine drinking cup. We'll chat more about those later. These boys weren't necessarily slaves, but could be aristocratic youths, and the symposium was one of the places where they learned to become men, seeing how the adults behaved, philosophized, told stories, and interacted with one another. The young boys were allowed to sit on the couches with the men, but not allowed to lay down, something reserved strictly for adults. Oh, and in classic Greek fashion, the boys who attended were usually nude, suggesting that part of this training for adulthood involved sexual relationships with the older men. This practice, known as pederasty, was something commonly accepted in ancient Greek culture, and serves as one of the major cultural differences that exist between ancient Greek culture and modern Western culture. The actual practice of hosting or attending a symposium required a great deal of propriety and etiquette. Decorum required that you get cleaned up and dressed up before arriving at the symposium. And even after that, once you got there, a slave of the host would wash your hands and feet and make sure you were looking good as hell by the time the party started. First on the list of night's activities was dinner. As anyone who's ever gone out for a heavy night of drinking without eating first, eating some food is a crucial part to making it to the end of the night. Perhaps surprisingly, Greek meals at the symposium weren't that luxurious or heavy. Think more something like a nice charcuterie with everything from olives and cheese to lentils and bread. Dessert would usually be something simple like fruit, and of course, a heavy dose of wine to wash it all down. Once dinner was done, the real party began. And for the next several hours, things slowly got more intense, trying to walk right up to the line of drunken madness without crossing over into it. Moderation was quite important for the Greeks after all. Foreshadowing a future lecture, the phrase, "nothing in excess," was inscribed on the entranceway into the Temple of Delphi. And in order to make sure that the line into inappropriateness wasn't crossed, a master of ceremonies was appointed for the night. Not always the host, but usually someone chosen randomly from the group. It was their job to make sure the wine was mixed correctly and that people had enough to have some fun, but not too much fun. Some examples from the ancient sources tell us what might be considered too much fun, and also what might occur on any given night. So for example, tearing off your toga and dancing around naked, or running around with one of the prostitute flautists on your back, that was considered too much fun. So remember that, no matter how much fun it might seem like, you're going to get kicked out of the symposium if you give a prostitute a naked piggyback ride around the androne. Don't say I didn't warn you there. Drink wasn't all that happened at these parties, however. Much of what occurred was ritual-based, differentiating it from a normal everyday get-together. This could involve anointing the guests with perfume and flower garlands, or pouring out undiluted wine in honor of Zeus or Dionysus. Since one of the main sources we have on the topic is Plato's Symposium, we're led to believe that there's no shortage of philosophical discussion at these parties. Plato's Symposium was written around 375 BC and recounts a fictional party, where a series of famous Athenians get together to deliver philosophical speeches in praise of Eros, the god of erotic love. Like many of Plato's works, the Symposium is written as a dialogue, with different characters taking turns speaking. Phaedrus, for example, praises Eros for inspiring virtue within people. Socrates, of course, deconstructs the whole idea of Eros, deciding that he's not a god, but rather a spirit connecting people to the things they love. Classic Socrates. Alcibiades, an Athenian famous for being a crazy-ass politician and starting all kinds of problems during the Peloponnesian War, then barges in wicked drunk and his body's been taken over by the god Dionysus, and he tells Socrates he's being no fun at all. Things get more and more wild and drunken from there, and eventually one of the guests falls asleep. And when he wakes up, Socrates is still going on and philosophizing, of course, as usual. When everyone falls asleep, Socrates decides it's time to go, always the moderate one, and so he just gets up and goes back to work. Well, business as usual. Even though Plato's Symposium is invaluable in terms of giving us an insight into the practice, we need to be careful as historians of the past. As a philosopher himself, Plato might be highlighting the philosophical aspects of the Symposium far more than would occur at a normal party. In other stories, we have evidence for men telling jokes, playing music, and reciting poetry. This often devolved into singing songs that lauded friendship and the social values of the Greek aristocracy, and that gave participants a break from the rigors of daily life, all while upholding the social structure that kept those people, those aristocrats, in power compared to the rest of the population. The songs could be what the Greeks called scholia, where guests sang one after another in a counterclockwise fashion, or siloi, comical songs meant to send people into laughter. And what party would be complete without an awesome set of drinking games? Don't worry, the Greek Symposium has you covered here as well. Much like today, the type of drinking vessel was crucial to the drinking games. The ancient Greeks drank their wine out of red plastic solo cups, or sometimes just pint glasses. Wait. Nope, getting past and present mixed up again. They didn't drink out of red solo cups. The ancient Greeks drank their wine out of a broad, shallow cup known as a kylix. The ceramic kylix stood on a tall stem and had two small handles. On the side of the drinking cup, they often painted eyes as a metaphorical way to indicate that drinking wine allowed one to see one's true self. On the bottom of the drinking area, they skipped the metaphor and just went for some funny or inappropriate kind of scene. So here we can see a young boy helping an older man vomit after he's had too much wine. Now the kylix was the crucial implement for the Greek drinking game of kotabos. This game kotabos was basically darts, except instead of throwing tiny little metal missiles, you were flinging the dregs of your wine, those little bits of sediment left in the bottom of the cup, at some target, usually another cup set up somewhere in the room. The drinkers would use the little handles of the kylix to fling their cup towards the target, letting the little bits of leftover wine sediment fly across the room. I guess if the darts metaphor doesn't work for you, you could think of it as a hybrid between flip cup and beer pong, except with wine, and fine ceramic vessels, and some of society's most wealthy and elite men. Just about the same. And then there was the entertainment. Remember how I said women weren't allowed at the symposium? Well, that's not exactly true. There often were women, but only of a particular type. These women were known as hetairae, upper-class courtesan prostitutes, and they were often also flautists, what the Greeks called lettre days. They would dance and play the flute and most likely perform sexual acts for the men in attendance. We have at least one account in the texts of Athenaeus, of a prostitute at a symposium who spoke after the men at a party fought over her sexual favors. The prostitute turned to the loser of that fight and consoled him by saying, "Cheer up, laddie. It's not as if you were fighting for a crown, just the obligation to pay." For the sexual favors, that is. In addition to these musical courtesans, we also get acrobats and musicians and dancers who could be brought into the symposium in order to entertain the guests. By the end of the night, the symposium often ended with some seriously drunk aristocratic dudes. A fragment of a play by the 4th century Eubulus summarizes the progression throughout the night. For sensible men, I prepare only 3 craters, one for health, the second for love and pleasure, and the third for sleep. After the third is drained, wise men go home. The 4th crater is not mine anymore. It belongs to bad behavior. The 5th is for shouting, the 6th for rudeness and insults, and the 7th is for fights. And by the end of the night, the room was hardly enough to contain the revelers. They'd head out into the streets in a procession known as a komos. So think about that. They had a name for when you got too drunk and went out into a procession in the middle of the streets. The comedic playwright Aristophanes describes one character breaking with good form by being so drunk that he was threatening to punch people who were just passing by, just walking down the street. It sounds an awful lot like being outside of the bars at 2:15 a.m. in the modern world. So we started out by saying how the symposium was a big party where elite men drank together. And that certainly is the case. But it's also so much more than that. The symposium was an integral institution to ancient Greek aristocratic society. It gave wealthy men a break from their stresses, and it gave young boys a way to start learning what it meant to be a man in Greek culture. From our modern perspective, however, it wasn't just a perfectly upright and moral institution. Aristocratic women were excluded, young boys were often naked and forced to engage in sexual pederasty, and prostitutes were a mainstay. For every song about friendship, there was likely a fight that arose from too much wine. So in the end, that balance, the balance between moderation and excess, the fine line that the Greeks used to distinguish themselves from the barbarian other, was often both highlighted and crossed at the symposium. And if this at all sounds familiar, it certainly should. Fraternity parties today still fill many of the same roles that of celebration and brotherhood and culture, while at the same time often crossing over that line into sexualization and drunkenness and chaos. And so while the symposium isn't exactly the same today, it certainly does have its descendant going strong in modern American culture.